welcome to human and time. Settle in wherever you are and let the noise of the present loosen its grip for a while. If these quiet journeys through the past are something you enjoy, you can like the video and subscribe, and then we can leave that small piece of the modern world behind. Our destination is not a palace, a battlefield, or the chambers of a pharaoh. We are going instead to a workers' village on the western side of ancient Thebes, more than 3,000 years ago, during the age of Ramesses II. And the question that brings us here is unexpectedly ordinary. What happened if you were too sick to work? Not a priest, not a king, not a figure carved larger than life on a temple wall. Imagine instead one of the skilled men whose labor was tied to the royal tombs in the valleys beyond the settlement. He is expected to work. His absence matters. His name belongs to a crew. Yet on some days the surviving records tell us he does not go. The reason can be written down in a single word: sick. It is one of those moments when the immense distance between ourselves and ancient Egypt suddenly narrows. The pyramids, colossal statues, and royal names recede for a moment, and in their place appears a problem that needs almost no explanation. A person wakes and finds that his body will not cooperate with the plans of the day. The evidence for this does not come from a modern reconstruction of what people probably did. It comes from the administrative life of Deir el-Medina, the settlement built for the highly skilled royal workmen associated with the tombs on the western bank of Thebes. These were not representative of every laborer in Egypt. They were a specialized, organized, and closely recorded community. That distinction matters. We are not about to claim that every farmer, porter, servant, or craft worker across Egypt enjoyed the same system. Our view is narrower, but because it is narrower, it is unusually clear. Deir el-Medina gives us something rare: the quiet paperwork of ordinary working lives. The village stood in the dry landscape west of the Nile's cultivated fields, close to the royal necropolis. Its inhabitants lived in a place shaped by the demands of royal burial projects, but their own lives were filled with concerns that did not belong to kings at all. Food had to arrive, water had to be brought, houses needed attention, families depended on one another, work had to be organized, and when someone failed to appear, a reason could be recorded. The most famous witness to this routine is not a monumental inscription. It is a large piece of limestone. Today it is known in the British Museum as ostraca EA 5634. It is roughly the size of an object that could rest across your lap, though far heavier and less convenient than paper. On it, a scribe recorded the names of 40 workmen and a long sequence of days. The surviving record covers 82 days. Dates appear in black ink. Many reasons for absence are added in red. There is something almost intimate about that choice of material. The hills and work sites around Deir el-Medina provided broken pieces of limestone, and these fragments became writing surfaces for an enormous range of practical matters. A surface that might have been discarded could instead carry a list, a note, an account, or a record of who had not come to work. We usually meet ancient Egypt through objects designed to survive: stone monuments, tombs, statuary, carefully prepared funerary texts. Here, we meet it through something much closer to office debris. A worker is absent. A scribe marks the day. A reason is given. And 3 millennia later, we are still able to read the trace of that small disruption. The word used for illness in many of these entries is broad. It does not usually provide a diagnosis in the modern sense. We are not told that the man had influenza or a stomach infection or a migraine. Most of the time, the record simply tells us that he was ill. The precise discomfort is gone. That absence of detail is important. It prevents us from turning the evidence into a fictional medical drama. We cannot choose a fever because it would make a scene more vivid. We cannot decide that a worker woke coughing, or that his joints ached, or that he had eaten something spoiled the previous day. The record does not permit that certainty, but it does permit something else. It permits us to see that illness itself was recognized as a reason why a man might not be at the work site. That may sound modest. It is, in fact, the foundation of the entire story. The workmen of Deir el-Medina belonged to an organized royal labor force. Their work was valuable, their movements mattered, and the administration kept track of their attendance. Yet the record did not pretend that the human body was perfectly reliable. Illness appears again and again among the reasons why a man could be missing. In the larger body of absenteeism records, studied from the community, sickness forms a substantial share of recorded absences. It is not the only reason. Men might be elsewhere for other duties or private obligations. Some absences are linked to caring for others, to family events, to religious or social activities, to preparing food or drink, or to work undertaken away from the main crew. The labor system was embedded in a social world, but sickness is unmistakably present within it. The calendar behind those marks also reminds us not to force a modern working week onto the village. Egyptian months were divided into 10-day periods, and in this particular record the later days of each period commonly appear as days when ordinary work did not take place. The document also contains many other interruptions. Of the 280 days it covers, only a much smaller number appear as full working days for the entire crew. That statistic can sound sensational when pulled out of context, but it should not be turned into the claim that ancient Egyptian workmen somehow enjoyed a year made mostly of holidays. The record does not represent every day of every year in the same way, and the state of the Royal Tome Project could alter what the crew was doing. A day away from the principal work site could also contain private labor, errands, household responsibilities, or work for other people. For us, the value of the document lies elsewhere. It reveals that a working day was not simply divided into two categories, present or absent, with every absence treated as failure. The scribe cared about distinctions. A man might be elsewhere. He might be engaged in another task. He might be dealing with a family obligation, or he might be ill. Those categories place sickness inside the normal administration of labor rather than outside it. The marks in red are therefore more than decoration on an old stone. They are the surviving edges of decisions once made in real time. The crew did not arrive as an anonymous mass. Individual names mattered. Individual absences mattered. And the reasons for at least some of those absences mattered enough to preserve. That is an unusually detailed view of labor for such a distant period. We are not looking at an ideal statement carved by a king about how orderly his realm was supposed to be. We are looking at the untidy difference between a schedule and the people expected to follow it. This changes the way we can imagine a workday. The sunlit cliffs beyond Deir el Medina make the route to the royal work areas seem close when seen on a map, but movement through this landscape demanded effort. The men were not stepping onto a tram or crossing a paved city street. Their work lay across a rugged desert environment. Archaeological evidence from the community suggests that repeated movement over this terrain may have contributed to stress in the knees and ankles of male workers. Temporary huts closer to the work areas also helped reduce the need to return to the village every day. So being able to work began before a tool was lifted. The body first had to carry itself out of the settlement and across the landscape. This is where sickness becomes physical in a way that the red ink on an ostraca cannot show. A man who remains in the village is not merely skipping the act of carving, painting, hauling, or preparing a tomb. He is also not making the journey that the working day demands. The absence begins at the threshold of the settlement. The village itself depended on a logistical system that reached far beyond its walls. Deir el-Medina was not surrounded by the green fields that fed most Egyptian communities. It stood in a dry place because its location served the royal necropolis. Essential supplies therefore had to move toward it. The workmen received regular grain rations, especially emmer wheat and barley, water, fuel, fish, pottery, and other necessities also had to be supplied at different intervals. In a place where the desert landscape could not simply provide everything a household needed, the functioning of administration was felt in meals, storage jars, fires, and the basic rhythm of domestic life. This is why the idea of a sick day in Deir el-Medina is more interesting than the phrase first suggests. We tend to hear those words and think of employment policy, a calendar, a manager, perhaps a message sent early in the morning. But for one of these workmen, the deeper question was not simply whether an absence was permitted. It was what happened to the entire chain of support that connected work, household, and state. If you could not work for several days, did your food disappear with your labor? The surviving evidence suggests that short periods of sickness did not simply cut a worker off from his regular grain support. That is why modern researchers have sometimes described the arrangement with language resembling subsidized sick leave. The comparison is useful, but only if we do not mistake it for identity. There was no modern employment contract lying on a desk in Deir el-Medina. There was no bureaucratic category identical to contemporary statutory sick pay. These workmen were paid largely through rations, not a modern cash salary, and their position within the royal necropolis workforce was highly unusual. Still, the practical result is striking. A skilled worker could be absent because he was ill, the reason could be recorded, and a short sickness did not necessarily mean that the grain supporting his household vanished. That is already more than a curious footnote. It tells us that the work system made room, however imperfectly and however differently from our own, for the reality that a worker might become temporarily incapable of doing his job. And because the records survive, we can watch that reality move through individual days. On Ostraca EA 634, the names are arranged and dates accumulate. The document is not written for us. It does not pause to explain the social meaning of illness. It does not celebrate compassionate administration. It does not condemn laziness. It simply keeps track. That restraint is useful. It prevents the past from becoming too convenient. Ancient Egypt was not a modern welfare state waiting to be discovered beneath the sand. The evidence comes from a privileged group of skilled state workers whose labor was essential to royal projects. Supporting them had practical value to the administration. A worker who recovered could return to the task. A household that continued receiving basic rations remained tied to the system that sustained the royal necropolis. Care and utility do not have to be opposites. In fact, much of human history lies between them. A community may help a sick person because he is needed, because he is known, because he is part of a household, because someone feels responsible for him, or because the system works better when people are not abandoned at the first sign of weakness. These motives can overlap so completely that a surviving attendance record cannot separate them for us. What it can show is that sickness did not make a worker invisible. His absence entered the record. And once we begin following those records more closely, individual lives start to appear. Some illnesses lasted only briefly. Others extended across many days. One of the most revealing cases concerns a worker named Ramesses II, whose illness lasted long enough for the record to capture an uneven attempt to return. He was sick, remained away, later reached the valley, and yet was still unable to work. He returned to the village before eventually resuming his place with the crew. We will stay with that story later, because it deserves more than a passing sentence. For now, it is enough to notice what it tells us about the difference between being present and being capable. A man could physically reach the place of labor and still be too unwell to perform it. The scribe noticed the distinction. That small administrative detail gives us a human image far more powerful than an invented scene. We do not know what Ramesses II felt as he made that attempted return. We do not know whether he believed himself recovered, whether someone urged him to try, or whether he worried about remaining away. None of that survives. What survives is simpler. He came. He could not work. He went back. Anyone who has ever returned to work too early after an illness can recognize the shape of the experience, even if everything around it is unfamiliar. The desert, the language, the tools, the political order, and the form of payment all belong to another world. The body does not. The body tires. It weakens. It recovers unevenly. It can appear ready in the morning and fail by midday. It can force an administration built around schedules and work crews to acknowledge that plans have limits. Deir el-Medina is especially valuable because its surviving documents allow us to watch those limits at close range. A list of absences tells us when someone was missing. Other records help us understand what the community did around sickness. There were men carrying the title Sun, commonly translated as physician. At least some of these medical practitioners were themselves connected to the workforce. One could be absent from ordinary duties because he was attending a sick colleague or preparing medicine. Again, we need to resist making this sound more modern than it was. This was not a hospital clinic with fixed opening hours. It was not universal state medicine in the contemporary sense. The medical role existed inside a world where remedies and incantations could belong to the same understanding of healing, and where family, neighbors, coworkers, and specialists all participated in care. That mixture is one of the most revealing things about the village. Health did not belong to a single profession. It belonged to a network, And even in the attendance records, the network leaves marks. One workman could miss his own work because another man was ill. A son could be absent because his mother was sick. A physician could leave ordinary duties to prepare treatment. These are not reconstructed possibilities. They are the kinds of relationships the records preserve. A sick day, then, was rarely only about one body. If a man stayed home, someone else might have to bring food, prepare something for him, watch over him, or take on a task that would otherwise have been his. A household adjusted. A work crew counted one fewer pair of hands. A scribe made a notation. The supply system continued moving grain and other necessities toward the village. The social cost of sickness spread outward in small circles. This is easy to miss if we look only at the red ink. It is also why Deir el-Medina gives us such a useful doorway into ancient Egyptian life. The village was built around one of the most monumental projects imaginable, preparing eternal resting places for kings. Yet its records repeatedly return us to the temporary, vulnerable lives of the people doing the work. The royal tomb was designed for eternity. The worker could wake too sick to leave home. That contrast belongs to this particular landscape. Beyond the settlement, the cliffs held tombs intended to preserve royal memory across unimaginable spans of time. Within the village, daily life depended on whether grain arrived, whether water could be obtained, whether a person was healthy enough to walk, whether someone could care for a relative, whether a household could manage until strength returned. The scale changes almost without warning. A pharaoh plans for forever, a worker needs another day, and the remarkable thing is that sometimes the surviving evidence allows us to see both at once. As the morning advances over the western desert, the work crew moves away from the village. The men who are able to go continue toward the places where their labor is required. A man marked as sick remains behind. We should not imagine a dramatic silence around him. Deir el-Medina was a community, not an isolated hut. Families lived close to one another. Supplies moved through the settlement. People worked, prepared food, repaired objects, exchanged goods, carried water, and dealt with the ordinary obligations of household life. The sick man is still inside a functioning world, and somewhere within the administrative life of that world, his absence becomes a line of writing. Perhaps that is the most useful way to understand the beginning of this story, not as the discovery that ancient Egypt secretly invented a modern employee benefit, but as the discovery that an ancient work system left enough space in its records for human frailty to become visible. The worker did not vanish simply because he failed to appear. Someone asked why. Someone wrote the answer. And from that small act of record-keeping, an entire landscape of illness, food, labor, medicine, family, and care begins to open around him. The limestone fragment lies still now, its black and red signs long separated from the voices that once understood them without effort. But in the days it records, the system was moving. Men were reporting for work. Others were elsewhere. Someone was preparing medicine. Someone was caring for a sick companion. Grain was being measured. Names were being written. And among them, on certain days, was the simple acknowledgement that one worker would not be coming because his body had asked for something the royal schedule could not command, and sometimes that request lasted longer than a single morning. The surviving records do not show sickness as a neat interruption with a predictable beginning and end. A man could be absent for a day or two, return, disappear again, or reach the work area only to find that his strength had not really returned. The body moved according to its own rhythm, while the crew, the scribe, and the royal project continued around it. This becomes unusually clear in the case of a workman named Ramesses. His name survives because scribes were keeping track of where men were and whether they were able to work. In one sequence, Ramesses is recorded as sick on 2 days. Then come days that were not normal working days. After that, he appears in the valley again. He had made the journey back toward the place where the crew labored. But the record says that he could not work. That distinction is small enough to fit into an administrative line, yet it opens a remarkably human space. Presence was not the same thing as fitness. The man had returned to the work environment, but his body had not returned with him in the same sense. Whatever illness had interrupted his routine was still strong enough to prevent him from doing the work expected there. We do not know what the illness was. The record does not tell us whether he was feverish, weak, dizzy, in pain, or recovering from some injury. It does not tell us why he attempted to return when he did. Any of those details would make the story more vivid, but they would also make it less true. What we have is enough. He was ill, he came back. He could not work, and then he spent more days in the village before eventually returning to the crew. Taken together, the sequence covers at least about 17 days of illness and interrupted work. For a man whose livelihood was tied to a state-supported labor community, that is not a trivial absence. It is long enough for the ordinary shape of life to change. The men who were well continued to move between settlement and work site. The schedule continued. Supplies still had to arrive. Families still needed food and water. The desert did not become easier because one worker was recovering. Ramesses' experience gives us a way to linger over something the attendants' lists themselves compress almost completely: the passage of sick time. A single mark can represent a whole day in which little or nothing changed. Another mark can represent a morning when someone hoped to be stronger and was not. A row of dates can contain the slow frustration of a body that improves unevenly. The scribes did not preserve those emotions, but the sequence of movement does preserve the practical consequences. For several days, a man who normally belonged with the crew belonged instead to the village. The physical difference between those two places matters. Deir el-Medina sat in the arid landscape west of the cultivated Nile Valley. Its location brought the workmen close to the royal necropolis, but not effortlessly close. The men had to negotiate the terrain between their homes and the tomb sites, and repeated movement across that landscape was part of working life. Modern bioarchaeological study of bodies from the community has found patterns of stress in male knees and ankles that are consistent with the possibility that frequent movement over difficult ground placed unusual demands on their joints. The evidence does not allow us to assign every ache to the walk or to reconstruct an exact daily route for every man, but it supports a simple point. Going to work was itself physical labor. The journey did not begin when a chisel touched stone. It began when a body left the village. This helps explain the importance of the workmen's temporary huts closer to the royal work areas. Staying nearer to the tomb sites could reduce the burden of repeated return journeys. Food and supplies could be kept there. A large storage vessel from the workmen's huts reminds us that the labor landscape included not only tomb chambers and tools, but also the practical problem of keeping people fed while they remained away from home. Health was therefore measured against a demanding environment. A person who felt only slightly unwell by modern indoor standards might still face a difficult question if the day required walking through the Theban desert before the principal labor had even begun. We cannot decide how any particular worker judged that threshold, but Mary Sekhmet's record shows that there was a threshold. He crossed the landscape, reached the valley, and still did not work. The administration did not simply erase that distinction, it recorded it. There is something almost gentle in the precision, though the record itself is not written to be gentle. It simply acknowledges a practical reality. A man may arrive and still be incapable. That reality appears in other forms as well. Most sickness entries do not tell us what part of the body was affected. The scribe usually had no reason to create a medical case history. For attendance purposes, sick could be enough. Occasionally, however, more specific information survives. 2 workers in the large British Museum attendance record are associated with trouble involving the eyes. Elsewhere in the Deir el-Medina material, references can point to problems involving a hand, a foot, an ear, or an arm. Some passages have been interpreted as referring to burns, though the evidence requires care. These details are valuable precisely because they are uncommon. They remind us how much of ancient illness has disappeared. A worker could spend several days unable to perform his task, and the exact condition might never become part of the permanent record. The administrative system preserved the interruption, not necessarily the disease. So when we move through this world, we should not imagine a village full of diagnoses. We should imagine uncertainty. A man knows that his eye hurts badly enough to keep him from work. Another knows that a hand or foot cannot be used as it normally would. A scribe knows only what needs to be entered, and the rest disappears. One absence, however, is startlingly concrete. A worker missed work because a scorpion had stung him. The reason appears plainly enough that no modern medical guess is required. Other Deir el-Medina records also preserve scorpion sting incidents, including one case in which a man was stung at night in another person's house. The detail immediately changes the texture of the settlement. Scorpions are not an abstract feature of a desert environment. When one has entered a house, found a human body, and altered the next day's attendance, the record does not invite us to turn the incident into horror. There is no need. Its force comes from its ordinariness. Somewhere in the night, domestic life was interrupted. By the time work was being counted, the event had become a reason for absence. This is one of the ways administrative documents preserve the environment indirectly. A desert creature becomes visible not because someone wanted to describe natural history, but because it interfered with labor. The same is true of disease. We rarely know the organism responsible. We do not know whether a particular cluster of sick men shared the same symptoms. Yet when absences are examined across many texts, patterns begin to emerge that a single ostracan cannot show. Modern research has studied 60 9 absenteeism texts from Deir el-Medina and grouped the recorded reasons for absence. Roughly 29% of the absences in that corpus were classified as cases in which a worker was too sick to work. Other health-related absences involved caring for another person, while many more entries simply placed a worker elsewhere without preserving a reason that can now be recovered with certainty. That 29% should not be rounded into the more dramatic claim that exactly 1/3 of all missed work was illness. The ancient evidence is too uneven for that, but it does show that sickness was not rare background noise. It was a recurring feature of the workforce, and when the dates are compared over longer stretches of time, another pattern becomes visible. Sick absences were not evenly distributed through the reconstructed year. In the studied records, illness reached its highest relative level around the part of the modern calendar corresponding roughly to May, and its lowest around December. Researchers have noted that this broad seasonality is compatible with patterns of infectious disease known from Upper Egypt in other periods. Compatible is the important word. The attendance records do not identify a pathogen. They do not tell us that a particular ancient epidemic was caused by a particular bacterium or virus. They show a seasonal shape. They allow us to say that sickness among the workers rose and fell over the year in a pattern consistent with at least some infectious illness. For a listener standing imaginatively inside the village, that distinction may seem subtle, but it protects the reality of the place. We do not need to name a disease to understand what it meant for several men to be absent at once. During the period associated with the 40th regnal year of Ramesses II, more than one worker was sick on the same day in a substantial share of the days on which sickness was recorded. In the analysis of that material, multiple workers were sick on roughly half of those sickness days. That clustering raises the possibility of contagion moving through the workforce. Possibility, not certainty. The men lived and worked in close social contact. They belonged to households, crews, and a compact settlement. If an infectious illness entered such a network, it would not need to respect the lines separating home from work. But the evidence never gives us the satisfying modern moment of a laboratory result. Instead, we see the effects. One name disappears from the active crew, then another, sometimes several. The scribe continues writing. The absence list lengthens. It is an epidemiological pattern seen from the administrative side long before anyone at Deir el-Medina could have imagined disease in modern microbial terms. Their own explanations of sickness belong to a different medical world, one in which bodily treatment, practical remedies, religious understanding, and spoken protective formulas could coexist without the boundaries we might draw between them today. For the moment, though, we can remain with the experience before treatment begins. To be sick in Deir el-Medina was to become temporarily out of step with a very organized community. The crew had a destination. The sick person did not go. The crew had tasks assigned within a royal project. The sick person remained outside that sequence. The crew's absence was noticed. The sick person's name still remained part of the system. That last point matters because illness did not necessarily remove a man from the workforce permanently. Most sickness in the records is visible to us because people eventually return. Recovery restores ordinary movement. The village threshold becomes a place passed through again. The desert route becomes possible again. A worker resumes the role by which the administration knows him. Yet the example of Ramesses II cautions us against imagining recovery as a clean line. His return was interrupted. The body approached normal work in stages. This gives the record an odd familiarity. Modern people often speak as though sickness and health were opposite rooms separated by a door. One day you are ill, the next day you are well. The ancient attendance list shows something less tidy. A person can be well enough to travel and not well enough to labor. Well enough to try, but not well enough to stay. The distinction would matter greatly in a craft environment where physical control and endurance were necessary. The royal tombs demanded skilled human hands. Cutting, shaping, painting, moving materials, and working in constrained spaces could not be reduced to simply being present. The administration needed people who could actually perform. That may be one reason these workers are such a revealing group for the history of health. They were valuable not merely because they existed on a roster, but because their specialized abilities were difficult to replace casually. Their health had economic consequences. It had scheduling consequences. And because these consequences mattered, sickness became visible in documents. That visibility should never be confused with equality across ancient Egyptian society. A farmer in another region, a household servant, a casual laborer, or a person outside a state-supported work crew may have experienced illness under very different conditions. Their sick days might leave no comparable trail of writing. The exceptional documentation of Deir el-Medina therefore gives us a close view of one community, not a universal law of ancient Egyptian employment. But a narrow window can still reveal a large human truth. It shows how an ancient institution adjusted when the bodies on which it depended became unreliable. The adjustments were practical. Absence could be recorded. Short-term economic support could continue. Medical personnel could have recognized roles. Other people could step away from their own work to care for someone who was ill. Each of those threads reaches beyond the person lying at home, and each will become more visible as we follow illness away from the attendance list and deeper into the village. Before doing that, it is worth lingering once more over the writing itself. An ostraca is a peculiar form of memory. Stone suggests permanence, but these pieces were often ordinary fragments rather than monuments. Their texts were created for immediate needs. A list did not need to survive 3,000 years. It needed to function long enough for people in the administration to use it. That is why the detail can feel so direct. The scribe is not performing for posterity. He does not explain ancient Egypt to us. He assumes the people around him understand the system already. A name is enough. A date is enough. A short reason is enough. The incompleteness that frustrates us is also what makes the record intimate. We are overhearing administration rather than reading a story written for strangers. This is especially clear in the large attendance document associated with the reign of Ramesses II. Its black and red ink does not create a narrative in the literary sense. It creates a pattern. Work, absence, return, another absence, a reason, a day when everyone is away, a day when only one man is missing, several men sick at once, a body interrupted by a scorpion, a worker present but unable to work, The human experience has to be reconstructed from those practical marks, and the safest reconstruction is often the simplest one. People became ill often enough that the system had language for it. Some illnesses lasted, some overlapped, some had identifiable causes or affected identifiable parts of the body. Many remain nameless. The namelessness is not emptiness. It is part of the world. Without modern diagnostics, without surviving case notes for most individuals, without a clear symptom list, uncertainty would have surrounded sickness for the people experiencing it, as well as for us observing it now. A person could know that something was wrong long before anyone could explain exactly what it was. A family could know that someone could not work. A scribe could know that the man's name belonged in the absent column. A physician might later be called upon to act. But the illness itself might never acquire a label that survives. The environment, meanwhile, continued pressing its own demands upon the village. Heat rose from stone and earth. Water remained something that had to be supplied. Food depended on the larger administrative system that sustained this desert settlement. The work sites remained beyond the village, and the royal project continued to require hands. This makes illness less private than it may first appear. A sick body disturbed movement through an entire network. One fewer worker traveled. One more absence had to be accounted for. Someone at home might have to provide care. A physician might have to leave another task. The household still needed grain. The crew still needed to function. Nothing dramatic had to happen for the effects to spread. That is why a single sick day can tell us so much. It reveals the hidden dependence behind monumental work. The tombs seem immovable when we see them now. Their walls are stone. Their paintings still hold color. Their inscriptions present an ordered royal world. But the process that created them depended on bodies that could wake with eye trouble, suffer an injured limb, be stung by a scorpion, or spend more than 2 weeks trying to recover from an illness whose name has been lost. The monumental world rested on vulnerable people, and the village had to find ways to live with that vulnerability without allowing every illness to dissolve the structure around it. The answer was not one single institution. It was a combination of record-keeping, material support, specialized knowledge, and human relationships. Even the categories used by the scribes remind us that health existed among other obligations rather than in a separate administrative world. A man could be absent because he was sick, because he was caring for someone, because he had been sent elsewhere, or because some other responsibility had taken him away from the principal work. To modern eyes, these reasons may seem to belong in different forms and different offices. At Deir el-Medina they appear beside one another because they all answered the same immediate question. Why is this person not where the crew expects him to be? That proximity is revealing. Illness was one interruption among many, but it was an interruption with a particular capacity to draw other people into it. An errand might take one man away. Sickness could take the worker away, and then alter the day of the person who cared for him as well. The administrative marks begin with one absent body, but the social consequences do not necessarily stop there. By the time the working day was fully underway beyond the settlement, a household containing a sick person might already have become a small center of rearranged activity. We should not invent the gestures made inside that house. or assign tasks to people the records do not name. It is enough to recognize the structural fact preserved in other documents from this community. Care could cost time, and that time could itself become visible as absence from work. In that sense, sickness crossed boundaries easily. It moved from body to household, from household to crew, and from crew to the scribe's record. As the day in Deir el-Medina stretches onward, the men who were healthy enough to work remain away from the village. Those who stayed behind inhabit another rhythm. Their time is no longer measured by the progress of the crew in quite the same way. For one man, the important distance may be no farther than the space between where he rests and the doorway. For another, recovery may already have carried him back across the desert, only to fail at the edge of work, and within the houses and working relationships of the village. The problem of illness has already moved beyond the person whose name was first marked absent. It moved into the lives of the people around him. A sick worker did not simply disappear from the crew and become a private problem behind a household wall. The records from Deir el-Medina show that illness could alter the working day of someone else as well. A companion might remain away. A relative might need attention. A man with medical responsibilities might leave his ordinary duties to prepare treatment. What began as weakness in one body could quietly rearrange several lives. One of the clearest examples involves a workman named Penub. On several days, Penub was absent because another worker, Apeti, was ill. The surviving record links Penub's absence directly with caring for him. There is no need to turn Penub into a professional nurse or to imagine an official caregiving post that the evidence does not support. In fact, the safest reading is much simpler. Apeti was sick. Penub did not go to his usual work because he was with him. Later, Penub is absent again because his own mother is ill. Those brief lines have an unusual emotional weight precisely because they tell us so little. They do not describe affection. They do not say what Penub thought about the obligation, whether he volunteered, whether someone asked him to stay, or what practical tasks he performed. They preserve only the consequence. Care took time, and that time was visible to the work administration. For a community built around a specialized royal workforce, this matters. If sickness had been treated only as the problem of the person who suffered it, Penub's reason for absence would be irrelevant. The record suggests otherwise. The inability of one person to manage alone could become a legitimate explanation for another person's missing day. This makes the village feel smaller in a useful way. The workmen were not interchangeable names on a roster. They were sons, colleagues, neighbors, and members of households. They lived in a settlement whose closeness made other people's problems difficult to keep at a distance. A wall could separate one home from another, but illness crossed walls easily. The practical reality of care begins with ordinary things. Someone who cannot work may also struggle with other parts of the day. Food still needs to be prepared. Water remains necessary. A person may need help moving, resting, or obtaining whatever treatment is available. We do not know which of those tasks Penub performed for Apeti, and we should not invent them. What we can say is that his presence with the sick man mattered enough to keep him from the crew. In a modern record, we might call that caregiving leave. The phrase is useful as a comparison, but it belongs to us, not to them. The Egyptian record gives us the human arrangement without the modern category. Someone is ill, someone else stays. The system records both. That pattern becomes even more interesting when we turn from informal care to people with recognized medical roles. Deir el-Medina had men carrying the title Sang, commonly translated as physician. The title should not make us imagine a modern doctor stepping out of a clinic in a white coat. These men belonged to an ancient Egyptian healing world with very different assumptions, practices, and boundaries. At least some of them were also members of the work community whose ordinary responsibilities existed alongside their medical role. One of the men listed in the large absenteeism record was himself identified as a physician. Evidence from the wider community suggests that the medical function could be supported with additional rations or compensation. Across the history of the village, several men bearing the title are known. This was therefore not simply a case of one unusually knowledgeable neighbor who happened to know remedies. Medical expertise had a recognizable place in the organization of the community, and once again, attendance records show us what that meant in practice. A physician could be absent from his normal work because he was attending a sick colleague. He could also be away because he was making medicine. The phrase is almost startling in its simplicity. Making medicine. It tells us that healing demanded labor of its own. A treatment was not merely an idea spoken beside a sick bed. Ingredients had to be selected, prepared, combined, or otherwise made ready. Time spent doing that was time unavailable for another task. The medical role consumed working hours, and those hours could be acknowledged by the system. In another case, a physician's activity is connected with preparing medicine for the scribe's wife over an extended period. The surviving record does not tell us exactly what the preparation involved, why it took so long, or whether the physician was constantly occupied with her care. Scholars have proposed possibilities, including the preparation of difficult materials or continued attention to the patient, but the precise explanation is not known. That uncertainty is worth keeping. Ancient medicine becomes less believable when every gap is filled. A quiet documentary can allow some doors to remain closed. We know that medicine was prepared. We know that medical work could alter attendance. We know that a woman connected to the scribal household received that attention. The rest belongs to the silence of the record. To understand what medicine could mean here, we have to resist another modern division. Ancient Egyptian healing did not separate practical remedy and sacred action in the same way a contemporary hospital might divide pharmacology from religion. Medical texts from the broader Deir el-Medina world preserve both prescriptions and spoken formulas or incantations. Material treatments and ritual language could belong to the same response to illness. A surviving group of medical manuscripts associated with the community includes texts that contain remedies alongside incantations. The Chester Beatty medical papyri are part of this landscape of knowledge. It would be a mistake to describe one half as medicine and the other half as mere superstition, as if an ancient healer were moving back and forth between two systems that only we can see as separate. For the people using these texts, healing could include both. A substance applied to the body and words spoken over it did not necessarily compete for legitimacy. They could address the same problem from different directions inside one understanding of how illness worked. This makes the sick room at Deir el-Medina more difficult to reconstruct, but also more truthful. We cannot choose a surviving prescription and assign it to apathy. We cannot say what Penub watched a physician prepare. We cannot claim that Ramesses received a particular ingredient, swallowed a particular mixture, or heard a particular incantation. The texts do not connect those specific patients with those specific treatments. But the community possessed a medical culture in which such practices existed. That is enough to change the atmosphere. Illness did not lead into a world empty of knowledge. People had categories, remedies, practitioners, and ritual strategies. They also had uncertainty. A healer could act without knowing a disease in modern biological terms. A family could try to help without understanding the cause. Recovery might follow treatment, or it might not. A patient might improve, relapse, or remain unwell for many days. The records of absence show the result of that uncertainty more clearly than the medical texts do. Work waits until the body can return. In this sense, the physician of Deir el-Medina stood at an interesting junction. He belonged to the world of treatment, but also to the world of labor. He was not floating above the village as an independent professional. He existed inside the same administrative and economic structure that counted workmen, distributed support, and expected tasks to be completed. When he left ordinary duties to care for someone, one form of labor was being exchanged for another. The Royal Tome Project lost his regular work for a time, but the workforce gained medical attention. That exchange says something about the value placed on recovery. It does not prove a modern humanitarian philosophy. It does not show that every Egyptian enjoyed comparable care. It shows that within this specialized community, maintaining health could itself become recognized work. The reason may have been partly practical. These were skilled men, and their abilities mattered to the state project. A worker who recovered could return to tasks that could not simply be handed to anyone passing nearby. Supporting medical roles, therefore, made economic sense. Yet from inside a household, institutional motive may have mattered less than the immediate fact that help existed. A sick man did not need to understand why the system supported a physician in order to benefit from the physician's presence. A mother did not need to fit herself into a theory of royal labor management for her son's absence to matter. Ancient systems often become clearest when seen from both directions at once. From above, the state sees labor. From within the village, people see one another. Health sits between them. This becomes even more visible when we look at the kinds of absence that cluster around care. Penub is not important because we know much about his personality. We do not. He is important because his record demonstrates reciprocal obligation in action. One day the sick person is a colleague, another time it is his mother. The social relationship changes, but the practical result is similar to Penub, is not at the main work. His labor has moved elsewhere. The attendance list therefore preserves something a royal inscription rarely would. It preserves time spent on another human being. No pharaoh needed to boast about that. No monumental scene had to display it. Yet the record survives. The contrast with the tombs being built nearby is striking. The royal necropolis was concerned with continuity after death, with preserving identity, status, and cosmic order beyond the limits of ordinary life. The village records, meanwhile, are filled with the fragile interruptions that happen before death, illness, injury, family obligation, temporary incapacity. The great project sought permanence. The workforce lived by adjustment. That adjustment could be very small. One man stays home. Another changes his plans. A physician prepares something. The scribe marks a reason. The crew continues with fewer people. Nothing in that sequence needs to become dramatic to reveal how deeply dependent the project was on human relationships. The dependence also complicates the simple idea of a day off. If Pennup missed work because he was caring for a petty, he was not necessarily resting. If a physician was away from ordinary work because he was making medicine, he had not stopped laboring. The attendance record tells us where a person was not, but it can also hint at what replaced the expected work. This is one reason the modern language of leave and absence must be used carefully. A day away from the tomb crew could contain responsibility rather than leisure. A person's body might be healthy while his day was still reshaped by someone else's illness. In a tightly connected settlement, sickness could therefore remove more than one worker from the expected rhythm without either man rejecting the obligations of the community. The network was bending around a temporary weakness. There is also a practical dimension to medical care that survives only indirectly. The village depended on supplies brought into a dry environment. Healing materials, like food and fuel, had to exist as physical substances somewhere in this world. A physician preparing medicine needed time and access to whatever the treatment required. Some ingredients may have been ordinary, others could have been less readily available. But because the approved evidence does not connect particular ingredients with particular sick workers in our records, the safest image is not a table crowded with invented herbs. It is the act of preparation itself, hands working over materials, a container being used, a treatment taking shape, a patient waiting. That is enough. The smell, texture, and taste of any precise mixture remain unknown to us in these cases. Historical restraint can itself create atmosphere. The room does not need to be filled with things we cannot prove. The uncertainty leaves space around the people who are present. We can know that the physician worked. We can know that the patient was ill. We can know that care occupied time. And beyond that, we can allow the ancient room to remain partly dark. The spoken side of healing adds another layer. Incantations in Egyptian medical traditions often drew on divine narratives and protective language. One surviving body of material associated with Deir el-Medina includes texts invoking mythic episodes in the treatment of dangerous conditions such as poisoning. This does not mean every sick worker automatically received an incantation. It means that spoken sacred knowledge belonged to the medical possibilities available in the cultural world around him. For people who understood illness within a universe populated by divine forces, symbolic actions and practical treatments did not necessarily belong to separate realities. The body could be treated materially while words addressed another dimension of danger. To modern ears, that combination may sound strange only because our categories are different. For the inhabitant of Deir el-Medina, the strange thing might have been the idea that the two should be kept apart. A scorpion sting makes this especially easy to understand. The injury is physical and immediate. A creature has struck the body. Pain and danger are real, but Egyptian tradition could also place dangerous animals within a sacred and mythic frame. Protective words could accompany remedies without anyone feeling that one cancelled the other. The practical and sacred could meet at the same wound. Again, we do not know the treatment given to the worker whose scorpion sting appears in the attendance record. The honest documentary leaves that specific scene unwritten, but the broader medical world helps us understand what kinds of responses could exist around such an event. And while the healer works, the administrative world continues. A physician's normal absence may be justified because medicine is being prepared. A caregiver's absence may be justified because another person is sick. The workman's own absence may be marked because he cannot perform. Illness creates several different records depending on whose day it has altered. This is where the original question about a sick day becomes something larger. At first, the question seems to concern permission. Are you allowed not to work? The records answer that early and clearly enough sickness could be recognized and recorded as a reason for absence. But once we remain inside the village, permission becomes only the outer layer. The deeper question is how a community absorbs the cost of a body that cannot function normally. Someone must lose working time. Someone may have to provide care. Treatment must be prepared. The household still has needs. The royal workforce still has deadlines and tasks. The sick person must somehow remain connected to the system long enough to recover and return. Deir el-Medina's answer was distributed across many people and institutions rather than contained in one policy. There was record keeping. There were medical practitioners. There were family and co-worker relationships. There was an economic support system that we will feel more clearly as the day moves toward the basic matter of food. These parts overlapped. None of them alone explains the whole experience. That is perhaps why the village feels so recognizable despite its distance from us. Modern societies often try to divide health into institutions: the workplace, the household, the clinic, the insurer, the government. At Deir el-Medina, the boundaries were different, but illness still ignored them. A fever, injury, eye problem, or sting could begin in one body and immediately become an issue of work, food, administration, family, and expertise. The form changed. The interconnectedness did not. As the working hours pass, the village is quieter in one sense because many of the men are away at the royal work sites. Yet the people who remain are not suspended outside the economic life of the community. A sick person remains part of a household. A caregiver is still spending labor. Even if the scribe records him as absent from the crew, a physician's preparation may take place away from the principal work, but it serves the community that makes that work possible. The village therefore contains two kinds of productivity at once. There is the visible labor directed toward the tombs, and there is the less monumental labor that keeps the people who make those tombs alive, fed, supported, and eventually able to return. Ancient records rarely value the two equally. The first belongs to royal purpose. The second appears in fragments, yet the fragments are enough. Penab remains with Apeti. Later, his mother's sickness takes him away from work. A physician spends time on medicine. A man with a long illness tries to return and cannot. The sequence is not a planned story, but it forms one when placed beside the needs of the village. Human beings maintain other human beings. Sometimes the cost can be counted in missed workdays. The written record makes that invisible labor visible only when it collides with the official schedule. We do not receive a daily account of every hour Penub spent helping another person. We see him because his care created an absence somewhere else. That is a useful reminder of how documentary evidence works. What survives is not a complete map of social life. It is a series of points where social life touched administration. Behind those points must have been many actions that were never written down. We should not fill them with invented scenes, but we can recognize their existence. No attendance ostraca could contain every ordinary act by which a household endured illness. Most care leaves no inscription. Most meals are eaten without record. Most nights of discomfort disappear completely. Even in Deir el-Medina, one of the best documented communities of the ancient world, the surviving archive catches only portions of what people did for one another. That makes the named cases more valuable, not less. Penub's absence tells us that caregiving could become important enough to enter official time. The physician's absence tells us that treatment could do the same. The sick worker's own entry connects both forms of care to the labor system that surrounded them. Three different people may therefore appear absent from the tomb work for three very different reasons, while all three absences belong to the same human event. One body has become unwell, and the village has begun to reorganize around it. The sun can move across the cliffs without caring who is sick, and the royal tomb can wait for the return of a particular pair of hands. But inside the settlement, time is being spent differently. One person's day is measured by recovery, another's by care, another's by preparing treatment. And beneath all of them lies the practical question that no household can postpone for long while work is interrupted. What continues to arrive, what remains available, and what keeps the household itself from becoming sick with the worker? And the answer begins with grain. For a sick worker in Deir el-Medina, the most important question was not whether anyone would use the phrase sick leave. No such modern category existed. What mattered was whether the household could continue to eat while the worker was away from his usual labor. The men of the royal tomb workforce were supported largely through rations, especially emmer wheat and barley. These were not decorative payments or occasional gifts. Grain sat close to the center of household survival. It could become bread, it could become beer, it could be stored, exchanged, measured, and depended upon. So when illness removed a man from work, the consequences could have extended quickly beyond the individual body. A missed day threatened time. A long illness threatened labor, and if support stopped with labor, sickness could also threaten food. The evidence from Deir el-Medina suggests that this did not happen automatically during short periods of illness. Regular grain support appears to have continued even when a worker was absent for several days because he was sick. That is why modern scholars have sometimes described the arrangement with language resembling subsidized sick leave. The comparison is helpful if we hold it carefully. It helps us understand the practical outcome. A worker could miss work because of illness without immediately losing the basic grain support on which his household depended. But the comparison becomes misleading if we let it turn into a modern employment contract. There was no payroll department calculating statutory sick pay. There was no universal legal right shared by all Egyptian workers. There was no reason to assume that a farmer in another region, a household laborer, or someone outside this state, supported community, enjoyed the same protection. The system, we can see, belongs above all to Deir el-Medina and to the exceptional workforce attached to the royal necropolis. Its strength lies not in being universal, but in being documented. A worker becomes sick, his absence is recorded. The grain system continues, and the household is not forced, at least by a short illness alone, to fall immediately outside the economic structure that supports it. To understand how significant that was, we need to look at the village itself, not as a cluster of houses in isolation, but as a place sustained by movement. Deir el-Medina stood in a dry zone beyond the cultivated Nile fields. Its location made sense for the royal tomb projects, but that same location meant the settlement could not simply rely on nearby farmland for everything it required. Food and other necessities had to arrive. Water had to arrive. Fuel had to arrive. Fish, pottery, and other useful goods moved toward the community through organized supply. The workmen's grain rations, therefore, belonged to a larger logistical system that made the village possible at all. This is easy to forget when looking at the surviving ruins. Stone and mud brick remain. The people are gone. The paths are quiet. The storage vessels stand in museums. But in the lived village, nothing remained still for long. Water was consumed and had to be replaced. Fuel was burned and had to be brought again. Grain was ground, baked, brewed, exchanged, and eaten. Containers emptied. The range of deliveries could extend beyond the basic monthly grain. Records from the community also preserve the movement of water, firewood, fish, pottery, and at times additional foods or supplies. Some provisions came more regularly than others. Oil, salt, meat, dates, cakes, and beer could appear within the wider economy of distribution and exchange, though not as a single uniform package delivered in exactly the same way every month. That unevenness matters because it keeps the village from becoming an imagined company town with a perfectly standardized benefits schedule. Its support system was ancient, material, and sometimes irregular. What remained especially dependable was the importance of grain. Emmer and barley formed the economic base around which many other necessities could be added. For a household dealing with sickness, that hierarchy of needs would have been practical rather than theoretical. A special food might fail to appear. A particular delivery might be delayed or vary. But the continuing relationship between worker, ration, and state meant that the most basic support did not simply cease the moment a name appeared among the sick. Households waited for the next distribution. The physical needs of the workforce created a constant current between the desert settlement and the wider economy that supported it. A sick worker remained inside that current. He might not cross the desert to the tomb sites, but his household still depended on supplies moving toward him. This gives sickness an economic texture. The worker's body has slowed down. The supply system has not. Somewhere beyond the house, grain is being counted. Elsewhere, water is being carried. Fuel is entering the village because people still need to cook and live. The royal project depends on healthy workers, but the workers depend just as completely on the network that feeds them. Neither side is self-sufficient. The state needs skill. The household needs support. illness reveals the dependency in both directions. The regular grain payments are especially important because they were more than an individual worker's lunch. They supported the household economy. A ration could be transformed through domestic labor. Grain had to become something edible or drinkable. It could also function within exchange. The economic life of Deir el-Medina did not begin and end at the moment of distribution. The arrival of grain connected administration to the interior of the home. A measure recorded somewhere in the state system eventually became food consumed by real people. That transformation is where an abstract payment becomes human. If a worker was sick for several days and the grain still arrived, the practical meaning could be profound without looking dramatic. The household did not have to treat illness as an immediate loss of its basic support. Recovery had time. This is one reason the community's health system cannot be reduced to the presence of a physician. Medicine helps the body. Food helps recovery remain possible. Economic stability gives the household room to absorb time away from labor. Caregivers give attention. The administration records absence. Each part supports the others. Modern discussions of healthcare often focus on treatment because treatment is visible. A physician, a remedy, a diagnosis, a procedure. These are easy to identify as medical. But at Deir el-Medina, the wider evidence suggests that health also depended on things that do not look medical at all. Grain, water, work security, social support, time. A sick day becomes possible only when a person is able to remain away from work without every other part of life collapsing immediately. This does not mean life was easy. It does not mean illness was harmless. A prolonged sickness could still be frightening, painful, exhausting, or economically disruptive in ways the surviving records cannot fully measure. The evidence simply shows that the system had some capacity to absorb short-term illness. That capacity was not accidental. The workmen of Deir el-Medina were highly skilled. They were responsible for royal tombs, projects of enormous political and religious importance. Their abilities were not infinitely replaceable. The administration had reason to keep them alive, supplied, and capable of returning. This is where generosity and utility become difficult to separate. It would be comforting to imagine the rations continuing because ancient officials had developed a compassionate philosophy of worker welfare. It would be equally simplistic to imagine that the workers were treated only as tools whose bodies were maintained for production. The evidence does not force us into either extreme. A system can support people because their labor is valuable and still produce real human security. A state may act from practical interest, while a household experiences the result as relief. The motives above and the effects below do not have to be identical. For the sick man lying at home, the reason grain continues to arrive may matter less than the fact that it does. For the administrator, that same grain helps preserve a skilled workforce. Both perspectives can be true at once. This is one of the quiet lessons of Deir el-Medina's records. Institutions are often most visible where their purposes intersect with ordinary needs. The Royal Tomb Project demanded continuity. Human bodies guaranteed interruption. The ration system helped bridge the gap. It did not make bodies reliable. It made unreliability manageable. The same can be said of the village's supply of water and fuel. A dry settlement tied to specialized labor cannot depend on improvisation alone. The inhabitants lived where the work required them to live. That created obligations for the system that had placed them there. The village therefore functioned as part of a larger arrangement between location, labor, and supply. Illness sits inside that arrangement almost invisibly. A healthy worker consumes water. A sick worker consumes water. A healthy household needs fuel. A household caring for someone ill still needs fuel. The biological needs continue regardless of whether the worker contributes his expected labor that day. This constancy is what makes support meaningful. An attendance mark may say that a man is not working. The ration system answers a different question: does he still belong? For short sickness, the evidence suggests that the answer was yes. Belonging is not written explicitly into the records, but it can be seen through continuity. The worker remains on the roster. His absence has a reason. His support does not simply disappear. He is expected to recover rather than vanish. This expectation gives illness a temporary character within the system, even when the illness itself lasts many days. The administration's response seems oriented toward reintegration. The goal is not to redefine the man as permanently useless at the first interruption. It is to accommodate absence long enough for ordinary work to resume. Mary Sekhmet's long illness becomes even more significant in this context. His attempt to return, his inability to work, and his later presence again with the crew show the process from another angle. The system can wait for a body, not forever perhaps, and not without limits that remain difficult for us to reconstruct, but long enough for a worker to move through sickness, failed return, further recovery, and eventual restoration to his place. That movement would be impossible to understand fully if we looked only at the work site. The household and supply system are what make the interval between absence and return livable. There is another reason to resist the phrase paid sick leave unless it is carefully explained. The word paid invites modern images of wages transferred from employer to employee. But Deir el-Medina's economy worked differently. Grain was fundamental. The materiality matters. A modern worker may look at numbers appearing in an account. A tomb worker's household depended on substances that could be touched, poured, ground, baked, fermented, stored, and eaten. Economic support had weight. It occupied space. It filled containers. It had to be transported through the landscape. This makes the system unusually easy to imagine in sensory terms without inventing anything. A ration is not an idea, it is grain. Dry kernels move against one another. A vessel becomes heavier as it fills. Hands measure what has arrived. The household knows whether its stores are growing or shrinking. The sick worker may be absent from the crew, but the physical sign that he still belongs to the support system can exist nearby as food. This is why the thumbnail idea of rations is not merely a visual device. It captures the economic center of the evidence. The question is not simply whether an ancient employer tolerated absence. The question is whether the person who stayed home could still remain fed. At Deir el-Medina, in the short term, the evidence strongly suggests that he could. The importance of this becomes clearer when we widen the view just enough to see who is not included. Most ancient Egyptians did not leave behind attendance lists of this quality. Most working people in antiquity are visible to us only intermittently, if at all. A laborer could become ill and recover without any scribe ever writing the event. A poor household could absorb the cost of sickness in ways that left no archaeological sentence. The silence outside Deir el-Medina is therefore not evidence that similar support never existed elsewhere, but neither is the documentation from this one village permission to generalize it across Egypt. We have to remain inside the limits of what survives. This is one reason the phrase Ancient Egypt in a title can open the door, while the narration must quickly lead us to Deir el-Medina. The title speaks to a civilization. The evidence speaks from a community. The distance between those scales has to remain visible. The same caution applies to the word welfare. A modern welfare state is built on legal, fiscal, and political structures that did not exist here in the same form. Calling Deir el-Medina one would flatten the past into a modern category. And yet it would also be a mistake to swing so far in the other direction that we fail to recognize genuine support when we see it. The workers did receive regular state-backed rations. Medical roles were supported. Illness could justify absence. Care for others could justify absence. Short sickness did not automatically remove basic grain support. These are substantial facts, even when we refuse to give them modern names. Sometimes the most accurate description is the least dramatic one. The community possessed mechanisms that reduced the immediate economic damage of sickness. That is enough. As the working day continues, this support can be imagined not as a policy statement, but as a flow of necessities. The village remains hot and dry. A household with a sick worker still requires water. Food still has to be turned into meals. Fuel is still consumed. Someone still handles containers. The work crew remains away. The physician may be occupied elsewhere. Penab may be absent because another person needs him. And the state system that feeds the workforce continues to move through the background. None of this is spectacular. That is precisely why it matters. Monumental history tends to show us moments when systems are displayed at their grandest. Deir el-Medina shows us a system functioning when something has gone wrong in a small way. A person cannot work. The project does not stop. The household does not disappear. The administration adjusts. The grain keeps moving. The sick worker remains connected. This connection can also help us understand why record-keeping itself mattered so much. If a workforce is supported through regular distributions, knowing who belongs to it and why someone is absent is not trivial administration. Attendance, labor, and support exist within the same institutional world. We do not know every precise reason why a particular absenteeism document was compiled. Some questions about administrative purpose remain open, but the detail of the records shows that officials wanted distinctions. Someone absent because he was sick was not identical on the page to someone absent for another reason. That information had value. The exact calculation behind it may be lost. The human difference remains. This is where some of the stranger absence categories become useful, not as sensational trivia, but as reminders that the system was socially complex. Workers could be away because they were performing private work, attending to another person, dealing with family events, or fulfilling obligations outside the principal crew. Some terms remain debated. Certain entries involving wives or daughters were once confidently translated in ways that produced claims about menstruation and time off, but the interpretation is not secure. The language may relate to purification or other circumstances. and the evidence does not justify turning the older translation into a viral certainty. The same caution applies to some records associated with death and funerary preparation. Older interpretations sometimes make the activity sound like full mummification, but the duration and wording can support more modest understandings such as wrapping or other aspects of preparing the body. These debates may seem distant from sickness, but they reveal something important about our entire journey. Ancient administrative words are not modern labels waiting to be translated cleanly. They belong to a social world whose categories do not always match ours. That is why sick day works best as a doorway rather than a definition. The doorway leads us to a place where absence, care, ritual, work, food and family overlap in ways that feel both recognizable and unfamiliar. Once inside, we need to let the ancient structure keep its own shape. The economy of the village also reminds us that security was collective before it was individual. A worker's rations supported more than his own body. A caregiver's lost work time affected more than the caregiver. A physician's attention redirected labor. Water carriers and suppliers sustained people they might never see at the tomb sites. The royal project was therefore held together by many kinds of work, some visible in decorated chambers, and others visible only in lists, deliveries, and absences. The people who painted, carved, and prepared tombs depended on people who kept food and water moving toward them. Illness made that dependency easier to see. A healthy worker can appear independent because he walks out of the village under his own power. A sick worker reveals the network. He needs time. Someone may need to remain with him. A healer may need to act. His household still needs supplies, and the entire system must decide whether temporary incapacity changes his status. At Deir el-Medina, the evidence suggests that it did not do so immediately. That may be the most important economic answer, hidden inside the red marks of the attendance records. To be sick was to be absent from work without necessarily being expelled from the structure that made work possible. The distinction is subtle. It is also enormous. It separates a temporary human weakness from immediate economic abandonment. And in a world where food arrived through organized distribution rather than from fields surrounding the house, that separation had physical weight. The day can grow later while the sick worker remains where he is. The crew continues elsewhere. The stone in the royal tomb receives another line, another surface, another measure of skilled labor. Back in the village, a storage vessel stands against a wall. Grain remains inside it. Water must still be fetched or delivered. A household adjusts its pace around a body that has not yet recovered. The worker's absence is real, but so is his continuing place within the community. And as long as that place remains, the question is no longer simply whether he may stay home. It is how long the system can continue to hold him there, supported, before strength returns and the path back toward the worksite becomes possible again. Until that return became possible, the worker remained suspended between two rhythms. One belonged to the crew, the desert path, the royal tombs, and the schedule maintained by scribes. The other belonged to recovery, household time, care, treatment, and the slower uncertainty of waiting for strength to come back. Deir el-Medina allowed those two rhythms to exist beside one another without pretending they were the same. That may be the clearest answer to the question, that first brought us here. A sick day in this community was real, but it was not modern. A worker could be absent because he was ill. The reason could be recorded. Short periods of sickness did not necessarily cut off the grain support on which the household depended. Medical personnel could have recognized responsibilities. Other people could remain away from their own work in order to care for someone who was unwell. But none of that means ancient Egypt had a universal system of paid sick leave in the modern legal sense. The evidence comes from a particular place, a particular workforce, a particular relationship between skilled labor and the state, and keeping that boundary clear does not weaken the story. It makes the story more interesting. Deir el-Medina was unusual precisely because the men who lived there were unusual employees. Their work served royal tomb construction. Their skills mattered. Their community was organized, supplied, and documented with an intensity that gives us a far clearer view of everyday working life than we possess for most ancient people. That closeness can create an illusion. Because we can see these workers so well, it is tempting to let them stand for everyone. They cannot. The farmer working near the Nile, the servant inside a private household, the day laborer without a secure institutional position, the woman whose work was never entered into a crew list, the person too poor or too ordinary to leave a written trace. None of them can simply be given the same protections because the workmen of Deir el-Medina had them. Silence is not proof of absence, but neither is one well-documented village proof of universality. The most honest way to remain inside ancient Egypt is to allow the limits of the evidence to remain visible. And those limits are everywhere. We know a man was sick, but usually not what disease he had. We know a physician prepared medicine, but not necessarily which ingredients were used for a particular patient. We know some illnesses clustered in time, but we cannot name the pathogen with confidence. We know a worker could be absent while caring for another person, but we do not know every practical action that care required. We know certain words in absence records have been translated in different ways, but some of those interpretations remain debated. This incompleteness is not a defect in the journey. It is part of the ancient world itself. The people of Deir el-Medina did not live with our diagnostic categories, our employment law, our medical institutions, or our bureaucratic vocabulary. Their systems were different because their world was different. To understand them, we do not need to make them secretly modern. We need to let their own arrangements remain strange where they are strange familiar, where they are familiar, and uncertain where the evidence is uncertain. That restraint matters especially when dealing with the most tempting claims. One old interpretation of some absence entries involving wives and daughters led to the popular idea that men received time away from work whenever their wives were menstruating. The underlying term, however, is not secure enough for that confident statement. It may relate to purification or another circumstance, and the evidence does not justify turning a disputed translation into a neat modern headline. The same is true of some absences connected with death and funerary preparation. Language once translated as mummification may be better understood more cautiously as wrapping or another stage of preparing a body. A single day's absence does not sit comfortably with the idea of a complete mummification process lasting far longer. These details seem small, but they teach us how easily the ancient world can be flattened into trivia. Ancient Egypt becomes a list of surprising facts. Ancient workers had weekends. Ancient workers had paid sick leave. Ancient men took days off for their wives' periods. Ancient employees had health care. Each sentence sounds satisfying because it brings the past close to us. But closeness is not the same as accuracy. The better story is usually less convenient. The work schedule followed 10-day periods rather than our 7-day week. The workforce was specialized. Payment centered on material rations rather than modern wages. Health support existed through a mixture of administration, medical specialists, households, and social relationships. And some of the terms in the records still resist confident translation. The world becomes richer when we stop forcing it into ours. By now, the day that began with one absent worker has opened into a much larger system. The worker's body led us to the crew. The crew led us to the scribe. The scribe led us to the ostracon. The ostracon led us to absence. Absence led us to care. Care led us to the physician. The physician led us to medicine and incantation. And all of them led us eventually to grain, water, fuel, and the material structure that kept the village alive. This is how a historical world reveals itself most naturally, not by moving through separate categories, but by following one ordinary problem until it touches everything around it. Illness does that very quickly. A healthy worker can hide the system that supports him. He gets up, he goes to work, he returns. The machinery of everyday life remains almost invisible because it functions as expected. Sickness changes that. The worker does not leave. Someone asks why. A reason is written. Food still has to arrive. A physician may be needed. A relative or coworker may lose work time. The household has to absorb the interruption. The administration has to recognize that the crew is incomplete. Suddenly, the hidden structure becomes visible. This is one reason historians can learn so much from failure, absence, and interruption. When ordinary life goes smoothly, people often have no reason to explain it. When something breaks, someone writes it down. Deir el-Medina's sick days survive because bodies did not always cooperate with schedules. The fragile body created the durable record, and the durable record now lets us see the fragile body. Mary Sekhmet's long illness remains the clearest example. We do not need to return to every date in his sequence to understand what it offers us. What matters is the shape. Illness kept him away. He reached the valley. He could not work. He returned to the village. Later, he returned again to the crew. There is no dramatic recovery scene preserved. No one records the first morning when he felt entirely himself again. No inscription praises his return. The administrative silence after recovery is almost the point. Once he could work, the disruption ended. Normality became less interesting to the record. That is how many recoveries disappear. A person is visible because he is absent. Then he becomes invisible again because he has resumed his place. The documentary can follow him only so far. Beyond that point, the evidence releases him back into ordinary life. Perhaps he crosses the same ground that had defeated him earlier. Perhaps the walk feels easier. Perhaps it does not. We cannot know. We only know that his status changed. The man who had been too sick to work eventually belonged with the working crew again. The system had waited long enough for that to happen. There is no need to make the moment more sentimental than the evidence allows. For the administration, it is simply restored labor. For the individual, it may have meant much more. But the record does not tell us what he felt, so we leave the emotion where it belongs unclaimed. This is one of the quiet disciplines of reconstructing ancient life. We can stand close to a person without pretending to enter his mind. We can understand the practical meaning of his situation without inventing his private thoughts. And sometimes the facts themselves carry more feeling than fiction would. A man went back too early. He could not work. He went home. Later, he returned. That is enough. The same restraint should shape the way we think about ancient medicine. It would be easy to romanticize the presence of physicians at Deir el-Medina and describe the village as having an ancient health service. There is truth underneath that comparison. Men with recognized medical titles existed. Their work could be supported. They could spend time treating others or preparing medicine. But their practice belonged to an Egyptian world in which prescriptions, sacred language, protective incantations, and practical care could exist together. The healer was not a modern doctor born too early. He was an ancient Egyptian practitioner responding to illness through the knowledge available in his own culture. That knowledge could be sophisticated in some ways and limited in others. It could recognize symptoms and practical treatments while also working within religious understandings of danger and protection. It could help. It could fail. And like all medical systems before modern diagnostics, it often operated without the kind of certainty we now expect. The workman's survival therefore depended on more than the physician. It depended on the body itself, on time, on food, on care, on the resources of the household, on whether illness was mild or severe, on whether recovery came quickly, and on whether the wider system gave him enough space to remain away from work without losing everything at once. That last condition is where Deir el-Medina seems especially important. Economic stability is not medicine in the narrow sense, but it can make healing possible. A worker who must choose between food and recovery experiences illness differently from a worker whose basic support continues for a time. The grain ration did not cure disease. It did something quieter. It reduced one immediate danger created by disease. The household could continue to eat while labor was interrupted. That practical continuity may be one of the strongest forms of care visible in the entire record. And it may also explain why the modern phrase sick leave feels both right and wrong. Right, because a worker could miss work for illness without immediate loss of basic support. Wrong, because the legal, economic, and institutional framework was completely different from ours. The ancient arrangement should not be celebrated as a modern achievement discovered 3,000 years early. It should be understood on its own terms. A state-supported specialist workforce had a system capable of absorbing human weakness for a time. That is already remarkable enough. It also tells us something about the nature of monumental labor. The tombs of kings often appear to us as pure expressions of power. A ruler commands, stone moves, walls are cut, paint is applied, an eternal house takes shape. But commands do not carve stone, bodies do. Specific bodies, bodies with joints that can ache, eyes that can become painful, hands and feet that can be injured, bodies that can be stung by scorpions, bodies that can become infected, weak, exhausted, or unable to work for reasons that the scribe may never describe more precisely than sick. The state can organize labor. It cannot abolish biology. What it can do is adapt. Deir el-Medina's records show adaptation in small forms rather than grand proclamations. A reason written beside a name, a ration that continues, a healer who spends time on medicine, a colleague who remains with someone unwell. These acts are administratively modest. Together they make the workforce durable, and durability mattered because the royal project was designed to outlast everyone involved in building it. There is a strange asymmetry here. The tomb was intended for eternity. The labor that created it had to be renewed every day. No amount of royal symbolism changed the fact that the work depended on whether particular people could get out of bed, cross the landscape, and use their skills. The eternal required the temporary. The monumental depended on the biological. And somewhere between those scales, a scribe kept track of who was missing. The ostraca in the British Museum preserves that asymmetry beautifully. It is not beautiful because it was made as art. It is beautiful because of what time has done to its purpose. Once it was practical, now it is intimate. Once its names belonged to men everyone in the workplace knew. Now they are points of contact with lives otherwise mostly lost. Once the red and black signs helped organize labor. Now they tell us that illness had a place in the record. The object has outlived the institution that created it. The tomb project ended. The work crews disappeared. The village emptied. The language changed. The administrative system vanished. Yet the reason for one man's absence can still be understood. He was sick. That is why the phrase feels so close, not because ancient Egypt was secretly like us in every important way. It was not. But because certain human conditions require almost no translation. A body can fail. A person can need help. Work can wait. Food cannot. Someone else may have to stay. Recovery may take longer than expected. These realities are not modern inventions. What changes across history is the structure built around them. Deir el-Medina gives us one ancient answer. Not the Egyptian answer. Not the universal ancient answer. One answer. A highly organized royal workers' community recorded sickness, tolerated absence for it, supported medical roles, allowed caregiving to affect attendance, and maintained a ration system that could continue through short periods when a worker was unable to perform. That answer is specific enough to trust, and specific enough to imagine. By the time the heat begins to soften and the working day draws toward its end, the village and the worksite begin to move toward one another again. Those who have been away will eventually return from the royal necropolis. The distance that separated the healthy crew from the sick worker narrows. Men come back from the landscape of tombs to the landscape of households. The village receives them. A worker who remained behind because of illness is still there. Perhaps he is better than he was earlier. Perhaps not. The records do not give us a daily emotional weather report. They give us statuses. Working, absent, sick, with another person, making medicine, in the village, in the valley but unable to work, returning. These words are enough to shape the movement of the day. They also remind us that history survives unevenly. The loudest people are not always the people we understand best. Ramesses II left a vast monumental presence. His name is famous. His statues are immense. His reign fills histories. Yet for the question we asked, the most revealing object is not one of his colossal monuments. It is a work record on limestone, The king gives us the setting, the scribe gives us the sick day, and through that small record, the worker finally becomes visible not as part of a faceless labor force, but as a person whose absence changed the shape of the day. That is the scale on which human and time can remain for a little while longer, not above the village, looking for a grand conclusion inside it. Close to the ordinary materials that kept life moving, a storage jar, a piece of limestone, a ration of grain, a path toward the tombs. A household in which someone has not recovered yet, a physician occupied with another task, a coworker whose own attendance has changed because care was needed elsewhere. Nothing here resolves into a perfect system. There were limits we cannot see. There were illnesses the records could not name. There were people outside this privileged workforce whose experience may have been far harsher. There were treatments that did not work. There were probably moments when support failed in ways no surviving document preserves. Historical honesty does not require us to turn Deir el-Medina into either paradise or misery. It requires us to accept the mixed reality. A demanding labor system could also contain support. A state could protect workers partly because it needed their skills. A physician could treat illness within a worldview that mixed practical medicine and sacred practice. A coworker could lose his own working time because another person needed him. A ration could be both administrative compensation and the grain that kept a household fed. These are not contradictions to be solved. They are the texture of the place. There is another quiet reason this matters. The record does not preserve illness as a moral judgment. The sick man is not turned into a lesson about weakness, discipline, or virtue. He is entered into the practical order of the crew. That makes the evidence unusually humane without requiring us to call the administration humane in a modern sense. The document does not need to praise him in order to acknowledge him. It simply leaves space beside his name for the fact that work was not possible that day. And perhaps this is why the surviving fragment feels less remote than many far grander objects. A royal monument tells us what power wanted remembered. An attendance record tells us what daily life could not avoid. Illness belonged to that second category. It was too ordinary to celebrate, too disruptive to ignore, and common enough to require notation. The men who wrote these records were not composing a philosophy of labor. They were solving the practical problem of organizing people whose bodies sometimes refused to obey the timetable. And as the village settles into another portion of its daily rhythm, the sick worker's story becomes less distinct again. If he recovers, he will eventually rejoin the path toward the royal work sites. If another man falls ill, another name may be marked. If a mother needs care, a son may remain behind. If medicine must be prepared, the physician's time may move away from ordinary labor. Grain will continue to be measured. Water will continue to be needed. The work beyond the village will continue whenever enough bodies are able to do it. The limestone record will receive more marks until its practical purpose is complete. No one writing those marks needs to imagine us. No one has to know that the fragment will survive. For them, it belongs to the immediate present. A worker is missing. There is a reason. The day continues. And somewhere within that simple rhythm, more than 3,000 years before our own schedules and sick notes and messages sent to say we cannot come in, An ancient community is already making room for the oldest interruption of all, a human body asking for time.